Kenneth Roth. He's a visiting professor at Princeton University and a former executive director of Human Rights Watch. He joins us live from New York. Kenneth Roth, good to have you with us. So reports that Israeli military units entered Nuseirat refugee camp concealed in civilian vehicles to rescue these hostages. Israel has denied this, but doesn't the use of civilian vehicles endanger the lives of humanitarian aid workers? I mean, there isn't a lot of civilian traffic in Gaza anyway. Most of those are humanitarian vehicles.
Well, I think we don't really know what vehicles were used. The initial allegation was that humanitarian vehicles were used, and that clearly would be illegal. That would endanger humanitarian workers. Now, Israel denied that. The report just earlier said it was actually a vehicle with furniture in it that was supposed to look like, a displaced person's vehicle. So I think we don't know. But what we do know is that, the investigation is needed to ensure that this was not an effort to pose as a humanitarian worker or a medical worker or some kind of protected worker, because that, that use of such vehicles would then endanger these people.
And tragically, hundreds of Palestinian civilians lost their lives, many hundreds wounded in this rescue operation. Israel says it has the most moral army in the world. But it does beg the question, Kenneth, what calculations were made to avoid civilian casualties given this horrendous massacre? I mean, it's clear that Palestinian lives are not equal to Israeli lives.
Well, I think we have to first recognize that while the numbers currently are at least 210 killed, over 400 wounded, we don't have a breakdown yet of how many of those were fighters versus civilians. There clearly was a firefight. So, I think we can't draw definitive conclusions until we know a bit more. But there are certain conclusions that we can reach. For example, the Israeli military says that it deliberately launched this rescue operation during the day, hoping to surprise Hamas. Hamas would have expected it to come at night. But the one problem with operating during the day is civilians are all about. And some of the bombs clearly fell either on or right adjacent to a market in Nuseirat, which was filled with people. And so in those circumstances, you predictably will get larger numbers of civilian casualties than if it had been a nighttime operation. That is inconsistent with the duty to take all feasible precautions to spare civilian harm.
Yeah, and in terms of some of the politics, Kenneth, I mean, is there a sense now that Netanyahu will feel emboldened by this rescue? I mean, he clearly wants to prolong the war for as long as he can, but does he really have the interests of the Israeli hostages at heart, or is he doing this in order to save his own political career? I mean, many of the protesters inside Israel feel that Netanyahu doesn't really care about the hostages.
I think that's true. In other words, if you even look at, how have hostages been released alive? This rescue operation means that a total of 7 have been released alive because of Israeli military operations, whereas over 100 have been released through negotiations. But at this stage, Netanyahu is a major obstacle to concluding negotiations with Hamas because he does not want to agree to the long-term, the permanent ceasefire that Hamas is insisting on. And that's very clear because, Netanyahu needs a forever war. Once the war stops, he then faces a political reckoning for the intelligence failure of October 7th. Why were Israeli soldiers, much more focused on the West Bank protecting settlers than adjacent to Gaza? These are basic questions that could easily topple his government and end him up in prison. So
just a final quick thought to you, Kenneth, if I may. I mean, we've seen these international efforts by the ICJ, the ICC, the UN to curtail Israel's massacres on Gaza, and yet we see this horrific massacre of Palestinian civilians yesterday. Have international efforts, do you think, helped or worsened the situation in Gaza? And where does this now leave those efforts to bring about a ceasefire?
I think the pressure on Netanyahu clearly is good. It's just insufficient. If you look at, President Joe Biden, he says the right things. He says, take more care to spare Palestinian civilian life, let in more food and humanitarian aid, but he doesn't back that up with action. He continues supplying the arms and the military aid that is used to bomb and starve Palestinian civilians. When the International Criminal Court prosecutor sought an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, Biden, said it was, basically, an outrage that this happened. So he's not providing real backing to his appropriate words of caution. And, Biden is the most important backer of Netanyahu. And until that changes, I fear that Netanyahu is going to feel that he still has a green light to keep going with the war crime strategy that he's been pursuing.
All right, Kenneth Roth, really good to get your thoughts and your analysis. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Al Jazeera.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.